who have been contributing to the tax debate for many years.
You're watching C-SPAN Public Affairs Programming. Coming up next from Washington, the American Enterprise Institute is holding a forum on tax policy today. This next panel will be talking about the political economy of tax reform. Panelists include journalist Jonathan Weissman of the Washington Post. And this is live coverage on C-SPAN.
Maybe the only one here, where he specialized in tax and business law, and he's the author of 2 books on taxation, The Failure of U.S. Tax Policy, and a forthcoming book titled Refinancing America, The Republican Anti-Tax Agenda. Not sure whether that's a pro or con anti-tax agenda, but I look forward to purchasing the book and finding out. With that, I'll now hand it off to Sheldon. I will also add that we're going to try to give everybody, once again, 5 to 7 minutes. And you know, the Washington Post is kind of a liberal institution, and that was reflected in Jonathan letting people go over. But I will tell you that I'm more conservative than Jonathan, and use the guidelines taught to me by that influential force in my life, Mr. T, when enforcing the 7-minute rule, which is that I pity the fool who goes past 7 minutes. With that warning, I hand it off to Sheldon.
Thank you, Kevin, and I want to thank people at American Enterprise Institute and Tax Notes for having me, and certainly congratulate Tax Notes on its 30th anniversary. I want to make 2 quick observations before I tell you a little bit about my paper. The first is, I've been writing on tax policy for 20 years. I thought I knew what a tax was. About an hour ago, I realized I didn't. It was too late for me to revise my paper or my talk, so I'll go ahead with the non-economics definition. The other observation is the last time I had C-SPAN and this many reporters in the room, I was speaking with Mike Gratz before the Senate Finance Committee on hearings before Senator Packwood's Finance Committee on the flat tax, and we had similar attention paid to the hearings, and I was also given I thought a 20-minute time limit. I came in right before the talk. Mike Gratz told me, and so did Senator Packwood, I only had 5 minutes. And I made a strategic choice. Instead of cutting out half my talk, I decided to speak twice as fast. The result was a disaster. The next day, I don't know if these are connected, Bob Packwood retired, and I was never invited back to the Finance Committee to speak again. Since I'd like to come back to AEI, I'll try to keep within Kevin's time limit and speak a little slower. My paper is called, Is Progress Possible in Tax Policy, considering whether, in fact, we've made any improvements during the 30 years that Tax Notes has been publishing. Certainly, Tax Notes during that 30 years has educated not the public directly, but educated people like me, academics and tax lawyers. Economists contributing have also learned, and policymakers. And indirectly, I think all of us, especially academics teaching students, have improved the quality of our understanding of the tax code and the tax laws. But I'm pessimistic over the possibility that we've improved anything in the last 30 years. Certainly those people who have been observing that for 30 years ago, issues of tax notes covered the same topics and seemed to have week after week the same debates, leads me to think that in some respect we're just spinning our wheels. Tax policy has been in many respects an endless cycle of legislation, regulation, litigation, controversy. What was a reform in the 1970s, something like, say, the alternative minimum tax, turns out to be that which has to be reformed 30 years later. And you open up an issue of tax notes from 30 years ago, we seem to have the same topics about corporate tax erosion of the base. That's why I actually found Ken Keyes' piece so funny, as well as Mark Weinberger. They were talking and sort of gave a mock preview of what a tax notes issue would look like 30 years from now, and it seemed to be just the same people, the same issues, and I actually laughed out loud. That shows a little bit how strange you are when you find an issue of tax notes to be that funny. I certainly couldn't explain to my wife what was funny about it. But it was also, after I thought about it, it wasn't just funny, it was depressing. Do you really want to be in a profession that nothing changes for 30 years back and 30 years going forward? Looking at progress, by progress we mean a gradual improvement rather than wholesale revolution. And the question is, have we really improved the tax system, the tax administration, and the tax laws? It's not likely. The system itself is one that's produced by, and tax policy is produced by policymakers who are elected politicians. Like it or not, it's not a blue panel commission from AEI, an economist from the Brookings, somebody from Urban Institute, University of Michigan, and Yale Law School who are writing the tax code. It's people who have to run for re-election, who have constituencies, who have coalitions, and who have policy goals that are partisan. Whether that's something we as professionals like or not, we could all agree what is a better definition of tax reform. That's not likely what the tax system itself would generate, and that's precisely what it hasn't generated. Sometimes I get accused of being an apologist for the IRS or the tax code, and I think it's simply as a political scientist, I've looked at the policymaking process and concluded this is exactly the kind of tax code that we want and deserve. And it's likely the tax system that we're going to get in the future going forward. As a result of that, I think I'm both more pessimistic and more optimistic than a lot of the other people on the panel. Maybe that's because I'm more of a moderate, and moderates are always somebody who likes a little of this and likes a little from the left and a little from the right and is hated by everyone. And I think that book, I'm trying to appeal to Republicans to buy my book on Republican tax policy, but they'll hate me after they read it. Although I consider myself one of them, but obviously a different kind. I'm more pessimistic in the sense that I don't think, contrary to what Larry has suggested and other people, that we're ripe for tax reform. In fact, back in 1996, that was my position on the Senate Finance Committee hearings, was the no-sayer, somebody who doubted anything was going to happen. It looked that day as if Congress was immediately about to repeal the tax code and adopt a consumption tax, some form of flat tax. And I was the one who was saying it's not likely. I still think that's true. We're not likely to see fundamental tax reform, by evidenced by the fact that everyone on these panels so far have really, I think, defined fundamental tax reform in a somewhat different way. There is a consensus among economists that we should have a consumption tax, that it's more efficient. But after that, I don't see any consensus. Republicans have a very different view of what fundamental tax reform would be. And Democrats have a very different notion. It goes towards which groups would benefit which economic interest from cutting tax rates. There doesn't even seem to be consensus anymore that the goal of the tax system is to raise revenue. In that respect, it's almost as if the two parties are dedicated to giving away revenue rather than raising revenue. My perspective is more that you should never touch the golden goose. The golden goose is the personal income tax. Not the corporate income tax, but the personal income tax, which has, in years past, not in fiscal year 2001, raised over $1 trillion. That's the main source of revenue for the federal government, and I would be much more cautious about ripping it out by the roots and tossing it aside. If you remember back in July 2000, Steve Largent and the Republicans in the House adopted a bill that they knew the Senate would veto their side, but it was a bill that was going to simply sunset the tax code with no provision for replacing it. Now, that's pretty dramatic. It's grandstanding, but it's also fairly foolish. I think those Republicans who have pushed for fundamental tax reform have wasted a lot of good opportunities since 1994 elections. The 105th Congress through the 107th have achieved very little, despite surprisingly having majorities for the first time in 40 years in both Congress, and some cases even having control of the presidency as well. As a result of that, I'm much more cautious. The optimistic side of my paper is that I do see some improvements over the last 30 years. Not enough to be optimistic that we're going to achieve fundamental reform, but rather that we have improved some things like budgeting. We have a better system in place, although it fell apart this last year. Unlike Dan Crippen, the retiring director of the Congressional Budget Office, who gave a speech 2 weeks ago in which he said the whole system is broken and collapsing, I think it's maybe half collapsing, and it might be possible to resuscitate it. Other things, we have made improvements. Tax Reform Act of 86 was a real improvement. I'm just less pessimistic that we can adopt the principles from 86, revenue neutrality and distributional neutrality. although Mike Gratz would adopt it, and obviously Gene Sterling would. The problem is I'm not sure that the political forces and coalitions are there to support that kind of tax reform. End result is, looking forward towards tax policy in the next 30 years, I won't take a shot at making a prediction over the next century, as our theme seems to suggest. It's hard to make projections 2 years from now, let alone 30 years from now. Nevertheless, I think we probably will have some marginal improvements. We have a chance to vaguely improve the budget process, tune up some of the problems. We probably can't reform and eliminate the alternative minimum tax. We might be able to phase it out. And proposals like Mike has suggested, Mike Gratz's suggestion that we don't phase out or throw overboard the income tax, but rather adopt a VAT and supplement it, use that revenue to fine-tune and eliminate some of the complexity and the worst features of the income tax or the alternative minimum tax, is probably the way we should go. And hopefully I'm optimistic that we could do at least that much, but not much more than that.
Well, thank you very much, Sheldon, and you did a good job of staying on time. Our next speaker is Jane Gravel. And yeah, please hold applause to the end, too, because we're trying to squeeze stuff in into an hour. Jane Gravel is a senior specialist in economic policy in the Government and Finance Division of CRS. Jane